regardless of what we think. We know that you love us, and the reason we know you love us is because while we were yet sinners, you died for us. In your most precious Son's name, amen. You know, we live in a world where I think, not to sound like too much like Star Trek, but we've taken on the Klingon philosophy. Everything's about getting revenge. And it just sounds radical when we talk about being forgiving. I mean, we don't like to think about forgiveness because, we're owed that. We have a right to that. You know, I remember reading a story, and it's a true story, and I probably don't have the names right, so I'm not even going to try to use the names, but anyway, this young man was out driving, and he was partying, and he was 19, and he was in first year of college, and he got drunk. He was totally wasted, and he ended up driving his car, and as he's driving along, he ran a red light and broadsided another car. In that other car was a 17-year-old young lady on her way home from having worked as a volunteer at a Christian orphanage. She was there raising funds to help supply needs for the kids. It was something she did on a regular basis. She loved Jesus, and she loved those kids, and she wanted to do, in fact, her whole life, she'd just been accepted to college. She wanted to be a teacher, and she was so excited about being able to help people. She had a full-time, steady boyfriend, and they both really seemed to love Jesus, and they both talked about their faith and how making Christ first in their lives. When he broadsided that car, she died on the way to the hospital. The mother and father were devastated. The boyfriend was extremely devastated. Her whole family just felt in shock. The young man was arrested, and he received 18 years in prison. Now, I understand this was years ago, and this was back before the laws changed, and back then, a DUI, even a DUI manslaughter, which is what they called it, didn't get you the death penalty or life. Today, in these times, in Texas and in Florida and other states, if you killed somebody while driving drunk, they consider it premeditated murder, and you can get the death penalty for it, although usually it's just life without parole. But he was 19, and he was serving 18 years without possibility of probation or parole until he'd served his 18 years. And then he had 75 years of probation to follow after that, so he was always going to be watched for the rest of his life. And the mother was just so angry. She didn't understand how such a young man could do such a thing. She was praying and trying to get through this and trying to understand why God would allow this to happen. And she was technically mad at God. She was actually yelling at him because he took her daughter. And she read this verse. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. And it broke through to her. And she thought, how do I forgive in a situation like that? How do I forgive when by definition what has happened to you is so unforgivable? And she thought, Jesus, you forgave when what happened to you was truly unforgivable. On the cross, hanging there, you prayed that the Father would forgive those who were crucifying you. And I know that I was one of the ones who was crucifying you. And the more she struggled with it, the more she prayed about it, the more she decided that she was going to reach out to that young man and forgive him. She began to write him, best she could do at that point, because she just didn't know she could face him. And he wrote her, and she wrote him, and she told him about Jesus in her letters, and she told him that she forgave him, and that God wanted him to forgive her, and wanted her to forgive him, and she didn't quite. She admitted she was struggling with it, but she said, I'm doing my best to forgive you and not hold a grudge against you, because I know that God has already forgiven you. And something in those letters and something in the way she talked to him He eventually became a Christian in prison, and she eventually began to visit him. At first, every month. But then she became a regular visitor. Her and her husband all went to visit him every week after church. Over time, he changed. His faith in Christ became stronger. Near the end of his sentence, the wife and the husband had basically adopted him as their child. And so when he was released after his 18 years and he started his probation, they took him in. They helped him find a place to stay, and they helped him get a job, and they helped him support him until he got on his feet. Helped him get plugged into a church. Supported, prayed for him. We think of that and we say that, oh man, that's crazy. How could you possibly forgive? How could you even take that person in? I mean, he killed your daughter. How can you forgive the unforgivable situation? But that's just it. You and I, Christ forgave us. And there is absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing, that anyone can do to you that compare to what we did to his son. And look at it this way. It's Friday morning, day before Passover starts at dark. It's 9 a.m. He's led out. The Roman guards are sitting outside the Damascus gate at a rocky outcropping, and if you studied it at a certain angle, it kind of looked like a skull. You could see eroded in limestone 2 sockets for the eyes, and a place for the nose, and maybe even a place for the mouth. Skull Hill in English, they called it Golgotha, was the place where the Romans did their crucifying. And Friday was the day, and 9 o'clock was the time. Soldiers were ready to do their dirty work. They were Roman soldiers. They were from another part of the world. They weren't Jewish. They weren't Palestinian. They weren't from that area. They weren't followers of the Bible or the law. They were simply soldiers, and they'd been given orders. And that happened at that day and that time. They were on the death squad. They were in charge of crucifixions. Roman soldiers were quite efficient at it. After all, if you did it wrong, the Roman army way of taking care of people who failed was to execute them. Kind of a unique way of taking care of anybody who messed up. You learn from the mistakes of others, or you didn't learn at all, because if you made the mistake, you didn't live long. And failure to crucify somebody who you were given to crucify would end up you being executed if they survived the crucifixion. Never happened in the entire history of the Roman army, the Roman Empire. No one ever survived a crucifixion. The Roman soldiers made sure of that. I only had 3 this morning. Only 3. They didn't know the names. They never did, and it really didn't matter. They were just the executioners. From their point of view, it didn't pay to stop and think what they would did. That was for someone higher up the ladder. Guilt and innocence wasn't what they cared about. They go crazy if they started worrying about things like that. They simply had a job to do. And to do their job, they needed 2 things. They needed toughness, and they needed good technique. If they did a sloppy job, they would be the next one hanging on that tree being crucified. So it's 9, and up the road comes a group of people. Soldiers know that 2 of the men being crucified are just average, ordinary criminals. The kind of low-life scum that fills any big city anywhere in the world. And that's no big deal. After all, they did thousands upon thousands of crucifixions every year. 3 guys was nothing. The 3rd man, the one from up north, the preacher from Nazareth, his case is different. They really don't know who he is. They know it's important because they sense the buzz in the crowd. There are more people than usual. And by the way, there's always fringe elements, if you want to call it that, for being on the crucifixion quad. He never worked alone. There's something mortifyingly fascinating about watching someone else die. The people of Jerusalem, at least some of them, loved to come out and see the crucifixions, taunt them, throw trash at them. Maybe they didn't really love it, but they just couldn't stay away. There was some strange magnetic force drew them to Skull Hill again and again. But this day, there were a whole lot more people than usual. A big crowd, noisier, rowdier, milling to and fro, waiting for the action to begin. Up the road comes a parade of people, led by a brawny, dark-skinned foreigner carrying a cross. It couldn't be the one they were going to crucify. Turns out it was a man named Simon of Cyrene, a guy they had picked out of the crowd because the guy that they were crucifying couldn't carry the weight of the crossbeam. Of course, crowd swirls around him. Behind him is a stooped figure, a man not quite 6 feet tall, now walking, now crawling, every step an agony behold. Half a man, really, half a creature from the worst nightmare you've ever had. He'd been beaten within an inch of his life. His back was hanging in shreds. His front was covered with the markings of the whip. His face was disfigured and swollen where they had ripped the beard out by roots. And on his head a crown of thorns 6 inches long stuck under the skin. A shell of a man already more dead than alive. But the fellows of the crucifixion detail saw that. They were happy, because some people got a little feisty when they tried to nail them to a cross. No, they didn't mind getting a person who was almost dead because it meant their work would be much more easier. So they laid the cross out on the ground. They laid the body of Jesus on the cross. He didn't do much more than moan. One hand over here, one hand over there. Wrapped the rope around his arm and around that arm. Rope around his legs, probably bent and partially resting on a small platform. They drove the spike into the forearm side of the wrist so that when the weight of the cross fell, the spike wouldn't rip all the way through the hand. A spike in both wrists and a spike through the legs. With the ropes in place, they began to pull the cross up. Jesus probably bled from the raw wounds. Steady now, boys. Steady. Don't drop it. It was a terrible thing to drop a cross before they got it in the hole. They dropped it and it fell with a thud. And there was Jesus, naked and exposed before the world, beaten, bruised, and bloody. Not more than a couple inches off the ground, because it didn't take much. They didn't have to have a real tall cross. Just enough so they couldn't touch the ground. Just enough so they couldn't rest their hands or rest their arms. And in fact, the only way they could breathe was to push up on the feet, the spike in their feet, to take a breath. Soldiers were satisfied. It's a job well done. Someone said, "Get the dice. Let's roll for their clothes." Let's face it, folks. What they did that day was unforgivable. That's the definition of what unforgivable is. When you crucify the Son of God, you've done what is beyond beyond forgiveness. It is truly unforgivable. And Jesus said in his first words from the cross, the first words weren't on him, the first words on his pain, the first words on what the injustice being done to him. No, what did he say? "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." It was the unforgivable sin, yet Jesus said, "Father, forgive them." The reality is that he was up there for a reason. There were 2 men there with him. How do you forgive someone who's done something to you that's so terrible that defies any attempt at human forgiveness? A lot of us wrestle with that question. How do you forgive? "Father, forgive them, for they know." Well, he was God. How can he possibly not forgive them? Really? He did this because in Isaiah 53 it says, "For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors." He wasn't up there because he had to. He wasn't up there because of something he had done. He wasn't being punished for something he had done. He was being punished because of something we did. Because you see, that they, them he's talking about, isn't just the Roman guards. It wasn't just the Roman emperor. It was me and you. It wasn't just the Jewish leaders. It wasn't just the men and women in that crowd who were calling him names and cursing him and spitting at him and everything else and throwing garbage on him as he walked through the city. No. He was bearing our sins up there because we were transgressors. And God the Father said, I forgive you. Yes, you nailed my son to that cross. You drove the nails. But I forgive you. See, the problem is, we see all this, and it's really easy to say, well, I'm so glad Christ forgave me. But there's a principle here that we need to apply. See, the reality is, in the world we live in, our response before our relationship with Jesus Christ would have been what the Klingons called eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. You owe me, and I'm going to get justice. You betrayed me, and I'm going to make your life miserable. I'm going to eat you alive until you cannot move no more. You'll learn not to punish me. You'll learn not to betray me. You'll learn not to attack me. Isn't that what our world teaches? Isn't that what our society wants? Let's get all you can while you can, and the only one that matters is you. We've raised a whole generation in America that believes that what is most important is to get your own. The government owes you. Everybody owes you. That's what's so dangerous about this, the cancel culture nonsense, is because they believe that the world owes them, and they should never be questioned or attacked or disagreed with. And anyone who dares to disagree with them must be punished. See, that's the world's way of thinking, and it shouldn't be the church. Believers, I've told you before that Christianity is radical, and it's just that. It is very radical. We think, oh, no. How can it be that radical? And we look up, and our response after Christ is, forgive us our debts, as we have forgiven our debtors. Matthew 6:12. And then Jesus goes on to tell a parable in Matthew 18. And he says this, therefore the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in who owed him millions of dollars. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold, along with his wife, his children, and everything they owned, to pay the debt. But the man fell down before his master and begged him, please be patient with me, and I will pay it all. And his master was filled with compassion for him, and released him, and forgave his debt. And we know the rest of the story. Forgiven, he was released from what he was owed, and believe me, his debt was millions of millions. More money than he could ever repay. And in that time, in that place, in order to settle debts, everything you had became forfeiture. They could take your wife, your kids, your house, your land, everything, to pay the debt. It wasn't truly Jewish law, but it was Roman law. The king decided to have mercy. If you forget, because the guy couldn't pay it. The problem was, the forgiven servant didn't learn his lesson. See, the debtor couldn't pay what he owed. And so when he was forgiven, he decided he didn't need to show mercy. The offended can always show mercy. You don't have to choose to be offended. You can choose to show mercy. The problem was the servant who had been forgiven so much couldn't forgive just a little. They drugged one of his debtors in, one of the guys that owed him money, and from what we understand, it's probably about a day's worth of wages. It was a small amount. When the guy said, just give me more time, I'll pay it, the guy didn't say, okay, not a problem, take your time, you're fine. No. This forgiven guy decided that he was going to throw his family and take everything this guy had and throw him in jail until he could be paid his debt. And the king heard about it, and then he suffered the consequences of that. You evil servant, I forgave you tremendous debt because you pled with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you? The angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. And that's what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart. And that sounds harsh to us, right? God's not going to forgive us? No, God's going to make you pay for your unforgiveness. I don't exactly know what that means in terms of being a believer. I believe that you're forgiven more than you could possibly ever repay. But our call is to forgive. You know, in the New Testament, it talks about, for believers, there's something called a suffering, a loss of reward. And to be honest with you, there's a lot of disagreement, a lot of argument about what that actually means. But you know what? Here's the facts. Whatever it means, your salvation isn't dependent on what you do on this earth. Your salvation is dependent on what Jesus did on that cross. But your reward in heaven, or lack of a reward, is impacted by the way you live out your faith. It says that some will get into heaven as if saved from a fire. Your works will be tested by fire, and only the works. So we need to learn to forgive. You know, I look at this and I think, Jesus forgave me? I mean, you study the word of 23:34, and you think, how could God forgive me of that? The reality is, it's possible to forgive the unforgivable, but remembering the people who are hurting you do not realize. If ever a statement seems to be obviously wrong, of course, that's it. Some say, well, Mike, you don't understand. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew what they were doing before they did it. They knew they were going to hurt me, and they went ahead and did it. When she told that lie, she knew what she was doing that was going to get me fired. When he double-crossed me, he knew what he was doing. When he stepped out on me, he knew what he was doing. When she broke the marriage vows, she knew what she was doing. He knew what he was doing. They knew exactly what they were doing. How can you even bring up that subject? They knew they would hurt me, and they didn't care. And they did it on purpose. What do you mean, Mike? Well, consider Jesus. Who was he talking about then when he said, for they know not what they're doing? Who was the they he was talking about? Well, you said the Roman soldiers. Well, did the Roman soldiers know what they were doing or not? Well, yes, they knew they were crucifying a man. Did they know who he was? No, they didn't really know, nor did they really care. If anybody really didn't know what they were doing, it was the Roman soldiers. It was just a job to them. Just the next grisly item on the Friday checklist. To them, crucifixion was what their commander ordered them to do, and they were just following orders. Next, please. Hand me the nails. Crucify that guy and let's get him out of here. It was just an everyday job. Surely they didn't really know what they were doing. Who else is the they? Well, you say it's Pilate's fault. Did Pilate know what he was doing? Well, what did Pilate know? Pilate knew that Jesus was called the King of the Jews. That's what Pilate knew. He knew he was scared to death of him. He tried to wash his hands of it. He knew enough to scare him to death. He didn't really know the whole story. What about Caiaphas? Caiaphas knew that Jesus was called the Son of God, the Messiah. What did Caiaphas do? I want nothing to do with this. Crucify him and get him out of here. Annas? Same way. Well, you say, what about Judas? Didn't Jesus know what he was doing? He was with Jesus for 3.5 years. Surely he would have known what he was doing. No. If anything's clear from the New Testament, Judas was totally confused about who Jesus was. Judas was convinced he was the Messiah that he had figured out. He was God made in his image. Judas fully expected the Messiah to roll into Jerusalem, kick out the Romans, and take over and return Israel to the golden age. Judas was baffled because Jesus didn't fit his preconceptions of what the Messiah was. It's one of the reasons he betrayed him, because he was confused and disillusioned and disappointed, and Jesus was talking about his death. You say, well, Mike, are you telling me these guys are not guilty? Oh, no, I'm not saying that. Judas was guilty, Pilate was guilty, Caiaphas was guilty, Annas was guilty, the Roman soldiers were guilty, and so were the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees and the scribes who conspired to put him to death. What about the mob? Well, yeah, they were guilty. And what about the spectators who came to cheer and to laugh him up? Well, yeah, they were guilty. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, or know what they're doing. Underline that word, because it's the key to the first saying of Christ on the cross. The key is not the fact that they did not know. The key is what? They didn't know what they were doing. They know what they're doing, but they don't know what it really means. They know what they're doing, but they don't know who they really are doing it to. They know what they're doing, but they don't know what the ramifications are. That is to say, they are guilty of killing a man, but they are guilty of much worse than they know. They are guilty of killing the Son of God from heaven. The problem is, we're guilty too. Without our sin, Jesus would have never had to die. So it was my sin and your sin that nailed him to that cross. We are far from innocent. See, what they needed was forgiveness more than they know. When Jesus cried, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing, he was really saying, Father, forgive them because they need forgiveness more than they know. Father, forgive them because they are in desperate need of forgiveness, and they don't even know it. God was looking down in history, and he saw, well, I see that Michael Boyd. And unless I die for him on this cross and I forgive him, he's doomed to hell for eternity. See, on that cross, who he was forgiving was me and you. And everyone chooses to accept his free gift. Oh, he would love to have forgiven everybody. But some people just reject the gift. You know, the same is true for the people who hurt you. They need forgiveness more than they know. It's true. They knew what they were doing when they made the telephone call, or when they wrote that letter, or they said that thing, or did that thing that tore out your heart when they left and walked out. They knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't know the enormity of it. They didn't know how bad and how terrible it was. They only knew on the surface. They didn't know how deep, and they can never know how badly they hurt you. The people who have hurt you need your forgiveness more than they need anything else in the world. Need it more than they know. And they will probably never change until they get it. And some of them won't change even after they get it, but still, you have to forgive them. So that's the deeper meaning of this first word from the cross. You can forgive the unforgivable if you remember that the people who have hurt you so deeply don't at the deepest level know what they have done to you. Forgiveness is what they need, and you're the only one who can give it to them. So how do we forgive the unforgivable? Well, first, we remember that the people who hurt us don't really know what they're doing. And number two, it is possible to forgive the unforgivable by remembering that Jesus forgave us when we were unforgivable. This is where the words of Jesus become very personal. We're included in his prayer. When he prayed, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, the soldiers, the women, the disciples, Pilate, Cephas, Annas, Judas, Peter, and all the Jewish leaders. You know who else was there? You and I. He was praying for you, and he was praying for me. Oh, no, Mike, you don't understand. I'm not like these people. I'm different. I'm not that bad. I'm not the kind of man who would crucify anyone. I'd never do anything like that. Oh, yeah, you are. And yes, you would. And yes, you have many, many times. And you will do it again. You're not as good as you look, folks. You've been there, you would have been holding the nails. If you'd been there, you would have been clapping and cheering. You would have been there, you would have been shouting, crucify him! Crucify him! Stick it to him again! Another nail, let him have it! It's not that much different. We're not that much better. You know what keeps us forgiving for people who hurt us? At the root of it is this. We think we're better than they are. We think that we'd never hurt anybody the way they've hurt us. I'm just not as bad as that. I'd never treat anybody the way they treated me. We get angry because we think that we would never do to another person what they've done to us. Oh, how foolish. Oh, how false. How deluded we are when we think that way. It is false pride that keeps us from the hard step of forgiving the unforgivable. Don't you understand? It's not as if we're all good and they're all bad. It's not as if we're all pure and they're all evil. It's not as if we're all of life wired together and they're just a bunch of fools. It's not as if we're totally in the right and they're totally in the wrong. It's not the way the world really works. It's not as if we know all the answers. It's not as if we're good and we think as we think we are. As cool as we think we are. As righteous as we think we are. As justifiable as we think we are. The truth is, we get mad just like they do. We lose our temper just like they do. We write stinging letters just like they do. We say stupid things at Christmas time just like they do. We slap our friends just like we do. We hurt our children just like they do. We crucify our friends like they do. We break our promises just like they do. When it really got down to that, we are them. No, we're them and they're us. And if we don't see that, we've missed the real point of Jesus' first cry from the cross. We think we're so much better than the people who've hurt us so deeply. We are self-deceived. Only you could see that when we really get down to it, we're all in the same boat together. We're all sinners in one way or another. And we all fail in many, many ways. We need to learn to see ourselves the way Christ sees us. We would admit that we really don't know it all, that we really don't have it all together. We would admit that we're not as good as we think we are. We're not as together as we pretend to be. If we'd ever admit the truth, we'd find it easier to forgive the people who've hurt us in an unforgivable way. The reality is, the difference between you and the person who hurt you, there's really no difference at all. None whatsoever. You know why? Because you're both sinners in need of a Savior. I don't care who they are. Doesn't matter. Right now, I've added 535 names to my prayer list. I pray for them every day. I'm thinking, who? In the United States, there's 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate. And I'm praying they all get radically saved. Because they need Jesus. He needs to be at the center of everything they do. The problem is that they think they're better than everybody else. And we think, oh, I can get mad at them for that. No, you can't. Because I think I'm better than I am. But all I am is a sinner saved by grace. The reality is that Jesus forgave you when you were unforgivable. When he prayed that prayer, he wasn't praying for them back there. He was praying for all of us 20 centuries later. First word from the cross was forgiveness. We were being told that by Jesus, that Jesus came to establish forgiveness. He is at heart a man of forgiveness. He came in his word to establish a church that would be an oasis of forgiveness, and to bring to this world a race of forgiving men and women. That's radical Christianity, folks. We're called to be like Christ. Would you like to become more like him? I suggest you start where Jesus started, by forgiving the people who hurt you the most. Appropriate message for us, isn't it? You know, We started this new year, none of us turned over a new leaf, regardless of what we thought. We brought all our baggage with us, all the hurts, the injured feelings, the thoughts about the past you can't get out of your minds, memories of people who've done us wrong. Some of you, you're already under terrible burden, remembered hurts in the past. Don't you think it's time to get rid of those things? I got a little exercise for you after you get done with service today. Here's what I want you to do. Some of you are going to need a bigger piece of paper than others, but I want you to get at least a 3x5 card. Across the top of it, I want you to write, Jesus, forgive them, for they know not what they do. On the left side of the card, write down all the things and the people and the memories in the past that have hurt you so badly. Make it brief and simple. I don't want anybody to see this card. When you're finished, add one word in large letters to the right of each hurt from the past. Forgiven. And when you're finished, take that little 3x5 card and rip it into little tiny pieces. Don't keep it. Rip it into hundreds of pieces and then flush the pieces down the toilet if you need to. Or burn it in the grill. Or throw it in the fireplace. And recognize that you're forgiving them. Because you're forgiven. From the cross, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. That was his prayer for you and me, folks. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you. We don't deserve your forgiveness. If it was about what we deserve, we'd be all on our way to hell. We've let you down so often. We've broken your heart so many times. Yet your Son looked down through history and said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. They don't understand how much they're breaking your heart, Father, with their sin, with their unforgiveness of others. Forgive them, Father. They don't truly understand what forgiveness means. They think the world revolves around them. And you, Lord, are it. Forgive us, Lord. Forgive us for hurting you.